Home Secretary, thank you very much indeed to you and to your officials for taking time today to come and discuss implementation of the SDSR. I think we are almost all here, but there may be the odd committee member that will come in. I hope you won't take that as anything other than any kind of discourtesy. But before we get into the detail of implementation and of the way that that is working, which is the focus of our discussion today, I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge last week's announcement that Sir Mark is retiring as the National Security Advisor. I think I'm right in saying so, Mark, that you're the first National Security Advisor to retire rather than move on into another post. And obviously it's a key role of interest to the committee, and you've given evidence to us more than once. Can you tell us why you've decided to retire?
Well, thank you, Chair, for those kind words. I have spent 37 years in the government service, and I just feel that the time has come to try something new.
You'll know that there have been reports that you and the Prime Minister either didn't see eye to eye over policy or over style or whatever. Is there any substance in those reports?
No, there is no truth in those reports. It's been a great honour for me to be able to serve two Prime Ministers, and I feel I've done my best with both those Prime Ministers, and both of them have said that they've been very happy with me.
I think the one thing that would be and is of concern to this committee, Sir Mark, is that, as you know, Sir Ivan Rogers has already left his post, and there is always a nervousness among select committees when there is a feeling that it maybe isn't wise to speak truth to power.
Well, I can't speak for Sir Ivan Rogers, Madam Chair, but I have never found it difficult to speak truth to power myself.
Well, I'm sure the committee is comforted and reassured to hear that, Sir Mark. Thank you. Home Secretary, your role now is as the chair of the SDSR Implementation Subcommittee. Is that, as you see it, one that you undertake in your capacity as Home Secretary, or is it something that's a somewhat separate responsibility?
I think it's relevant that I'm Home Secretary, but I view its chairing as rather separate. I'll expand, if I may. I think that the role of the Home Secretary is, of course, about security and keeping people safe. So it is relevant for this particular task. But when we meet, which we meet twice a year, the implementation unit, to go through what the progress, I invite the Minister of State to attend so that I am chairing it, not reporting on Home Office matters. And I think that's important. 11 of the commitments are Home Office related, but the majority are defence or foreign. So I think I have the right balance to try and make sure that I can be independent overseeing it, but informed in terms of security, but also keeping a little distance for the actual chairing.
Right, and that's your Minister of State from the Home Office?
Yes.
Yeah. So you said you meet twice a year. Have you met so far?
Yes. The committee met twice last year, once in May and once in November, which I chaired in the first instance, for my first time. We also have quarterly reports, which I get, and I have regular letters, correspondence from Conrad Bailey on behalf of the team to let me know any additional points. And when I meet with the Defence Secretary or the Foreign Secretary, I'm able to catch up with them as well.
So it takes a fair bit of your time, then, from the sound of it.
I don't think it takes a fair bit of my time, but it takes a fair bit of my attention to make sure that it gets the right approach. I wouldn't consider myself hugely expert on the individual commitments, but I take my responsibility of making sure the implementation is challenged very seriously.
Which is the point, of course, yes. What role do you have in producing the 2016 annual report on implementation? Are you kind of the lead person advising the Prime Minister?
No, I would not say I was the lead person advising the Prime Minister. I'd say that was probably you, was it, Mike?
Yes, Madam Chair. I mean, we prepared the draft report and submitted it to the Home Secretary as chair of the subcommittee, and then she passed it on to the Prime Minister for approval.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I answer something?
Yes, Lord West.
Home Secretary, who exactly, the group involves who exactly?
The committee?
Yes, who exactly is on it, and I mean as actual substantive members of it, and who's sort of in attendance?
Myself, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, I think Bayes is on it.
The Chief Secretary to the Treasury
Bayes.
and Bayes.
Yes.
He's a full member?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Blunt.
Home Secretary, your predecessor was the Minister for Government Policy. He was obviously a Cabinet Office Minister. What was the rationale, as you understand it, for appointing the Home Secretary to oversee the implementation of SDSR across the whole of the government?
I think it has to be a member of the NSC. The head of the Cabinet Office is not an attending member of the NSC at every event. So I think it had to be a senior member of the Cabinet who also attended the NSC. So I think that's a fairly natural move to either myself or the Chancellor, and the Chancellor, of course, chairs the Cyber Committee.
If we take the fact that the next National Security Advisor is the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office, you're now chairing this implementation committee. The Prime Minister used to be the Home Secretary. It's been said about the Prime Minister she's much more 5 than 6. Does that rather suggest that under the Prime Minister, national security now actually really means domestic security?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, I see where you're going with the line of questioning, Mr. Blunt, but I think we're all clear what the National Security Council, what we have to do there, that it is both foreign and national. And I think that there is overlap. You know, we're all aware when we talk about various elements of commitments about, say, immigration crime, there is international and national issue. I hope that we will continue to see the same emphasis on international issues while incorporating national issues as well.
So, Mark, if you had to balance your time between international policy responsibilities and domestic, how would you balance those?
Well, I have 2 deputies. I mean, one covers a lot of what you might call homeland security, and the other covers a lot what you might call foreign and defence policy issues. And I cover both, obviously. I think if one looks at the agenda of the National Security Council, it's roughly 50-50, I would say, in terms of homeland security and international issues.
And does that apply to your time?
Probably my time is more 60-40 on the foreign and defence policy as compared to homeland security, because I have a very experienced deputy in Paddy McGuinness who does a lot of that homeland security business.
Home Secretary, the SDSR applies to a number of key Home Office policy areas. I think you said 11 key areas you have to address. The fact that you're chairing this, even though you're bringing your Minister of State along, would slightly suggest that you'll be marking your own homework. How would you respond to that criticism? And who's going to check the marking of your homework?
Well, I can tell you that the Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary are always alert to that problem. So I don't think that there will be anywhere to hide if those sort of discussions come up. It is a smallest number of the departments that I have to cover in the commitments. So I think we can manage that, partly because we're all very aware of it.
In 2010, when the coalition was formed, there was a Minister for National Security. Wouldn't it be appropriate to actually have a National Security Minister within the Cabinet Office attending the National Security Council in order to oversee SDSR implementation, and they'll be able to hold all the relevant departments to account without these kind of questions having some degree of justification?
It's an interesting suggestion, but I think that seniority in these situations matter in terms of talking to quite senior cabinet ministers as well. I think it's easier for me to do that as Home Secretary than it might be for a Minister of State in the Cabinet Office.
Thank you, Margaret.
I think Lord West has an interest and a view about this matter.
Yes. Indeed, I was the Minister for National Security, having produced the first National Security Strategy, and I have to say I agree with you, Home Secretary. Basically, the big beasts in the Cabinet couldn't give a stuff when I said I want you to do so and so. So there is an element of that. I'd agree. But I think it's unfortunate because I was able to focus on the totality. And I am concerned about aspects of what I call the existential threats to our nation, which at the moment terrorists are not an existential threat to our nation. And is there sufficient discussion, for example, of strategic requirements for things like production of certain weapon systems, what things are felt really important for our nation that we should actually invest in and ensure we have, and things like the steel industry? Is there any debate about deterrence in the sense of number of warheads? What is, where do we stand on deterrence? Looking at what the totality of the threat is, things like resilience, the just enough, just in time economy. What stoppage of certain things will cause us immediately as a nation to stall and lock? I'm not. Certainly, when I was the National Security Minister, I had great difficulty getting people wound up to do this, and I'd be very impressed if you're doing those things. But I have a horrible feeling that they're not, because it seems there's more of a slight bend towards internal security and counter-terrorism.
I don't think there is a bend in that way, but I do think that the committee that I chair doesn't lead on those discussions. Those are the sort of discussions I would expect to take place with the Defence Secretary internally, or with the Prime Minister, or at the NSC. My committee is about implementation. So unless there is a sort of change of direction from the NSC, which obviously meets weekly to discuss many of these different issues, I don't think that's necessarily the place for that discussion to take place.
But you can't direct the NSC to look at certain things.
Well, that's for the Prime Minister. I mean, and I could raise that as a possible suggestion for discussion should we need to have it.
Okay, and so Mark, well, I have to say I'm delighted that you speak truth to power. I always depended which power it was I was speaking to slightly, so I'm not as clear-cut as you are. Certainly at certain times of my naval career I wouldn't speak truth to power, or that would be the end of my career. Do you feel that there is this correct, as the National Security Advisor, do you feel that there is a correct balance, or do you think there has been a slight skewing? There is a feeling, I certainly have a feeling, that terrorism, because it's more immediate to what people are thinking about all the time, that there's a tendency to look at that, whereas actually our chance of being destroyed and wiped out as a nation lie in some other areas.
Well, I think we have a pretty good balance. I mean, it's true that we do discuss different facets of counter-terrorism on occasions, including the whole question of counter-Daesh activity in Syria and Iraq. But equally, in the course of the first couple of months of this year, we've looked at Russia as a state-based threat. We have looked at cyber in the National Security Council, looking at the questions of deterrence and whether one can develop a deterrence theory in cyber warfare and things like that. So there has been, I think, a very good balance.
I have three members of the committee who'd like to come in on this issue: Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Villiers, and Lord Hamilton. Dr. Morrison.
Your predecessor as chair
was quite clear when he gave evidence to this committee in May that his position within the Cabinet Office was important because a number of senior colleagues had an interest in this business and he was able to take a holistic view. Do you think he was right in expressing those concerns? And what do you make of the fact that the senior responsible officer for the three enabling funds, the CSSF, the Prosperity Fund, and now the Empowerment Fund, is the National Security Advisor, about to be the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office? Does it not start to look a little incestuous, which kind of brings me back to the marking your own homework bit? I'd just like to press you a little bit on your thoughts about how genuinely independent that assessment might be, because it looks, from an outsider's perspective, as if this is becoming something like a Home Office stitch-up.
Ooh, I can see that is a theme here, Mr. Mewson, but I would ask you to judge us by results, perhaps, as I move forward chairing this committee. It doesn't feel like that to me. I feel that there is sufficient independence for the chair to be able to range fairly widely and freely. The former chair of the committee had, of course, enormous status in the government and did a great job doing exactly that, making sure that he looked after the implementation. As Lord West has said, I think that status does matter, and I hope I'll be able to carry that authority when I check not only my homework, but really through the Minister of State, but also the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretaries.
Perhaps I could just add, Home Secretary, that maybe there's some misconception about my successor, Mark Sedwell. I mean, Mark Sedwell spent many years in the Foreign Office. He was my deputy when I was High Commissioner in Islamabad. He's been ambassador in Afghanistan. So he's by no means a Home Office creature.
Yeah.
Mr. Villiers.
I'm not quite sure whether this is the appropriate point to raise it, but I hope you won't mind if it is. Clearly, one of the most lethal terrorist threats in the United Kingdom continues to be the threat posed by dissident Republicans. Yeah. Obviously, thankfully, it seldom materialises in harm because of the effectiveness of the response of the police and MI5. But it would be sort of interesting to know how your work in the sort of fields in relation to the SDSR, how you sort of ensure that the machinery back in London is doing everything that it can to support the tackling of that threat, particularly the threat to police officers.
Well, I share your view that this remains a very large threat in terms of terrorism in the UK. And when we look at the terrorist uplift, the counter-terrorist uplift, it will be affecting all counter-terrorism. So I would expect that to be included as well. And particularly as we, increasingly see difficult times in Northern Ireland and Ireland, I hope that will certainly continue under our watch.
Thanks.
Lord Hamilton.
It seems to be more likely that if we do have a terrorist outrage, it will come from Islamic terrorists, and we may see a very, very large number of people being killed. If that was to happen, would the Cabinet initially meet on this, and what role would your committee play in reacting to a big disaster of that sort?
I'm going to ask Marla to ask the process on that.
I think when it comes to crisis response, it would be ministers meeting in Cobra, chaired by possibly the Home Secretary, possibly the Prime Minister, depending on availability and the severity of the incident. But it wouldn't be a matter for the subcommittee dealing with implementation of the SDSR, no.
Thank you. I want to pick up your points about seniority, which I understand in terms of making things happen. But Sir Oliver Letwin, when he gave evidence to this committee, talked about, I think, there were 89 areas of the SDSR that he was, if you like, chasing implementation on. And I just wonder, given your senior position as Home Secretary, whether you have the time and capacity to give attention to 89 different areas of implementation. How do you manage that?
Well, the system is that my committee meets every 6 months, but Mr. Bailey and his colleagues are working feverishly all the time in between to catch up with the tasks that we've set in terms of implementation and keeping us up to date with any questions we've had or any issues that might arise. There are 89, which is, of course, considerably less than there were in the previous one, which was 220. The purpose of the Implementation Committee is to check that they are all up to date and to look at where there might be problems and to ask departments to address them. I will chase that every 6 months and from the quarterly reports and my regular meetings. I don't find it as a huge time-consuming initiative for me, but I have to make sure that I give it the right time and effort, but it is mainly the Secretariat that will implement it.
Okay, I mean, I understand that, and that obviously makes sense in terms of that process. But essentially what you're describing is an official-led process which comes up to you when there is identified as a serious problem. So it's an exception-led matter.
I think it has more continuity than that.
Okay. What's the role of the Prime Minister in all of this? I mean, she wrote the foreword to the annual report on implementation. What's her role in terms of she's not formally a member of the implementation subcommittee. How frequently do you report to her on these matters?
Conrad, can you answer?
Essentially the Home Secretary writes to the Prime Minister after each meeting of the subcommittee, updates her and then we typically follow up on any further questions. At official level, we meet quarterly, senior official level across government. We base our reporting around the single departmental plans, so it's a thorough look at the 89 commitments. It's not by exception, and we report to the Home Secretary on a quarterly basis across the full number of 89 commitments.
So that would suggest you report formally to the Prime Minister twice a year, unless something big emerges which you feel you need the authority of the Prime Minister.
I would have no hesitation taking it to her attention if I needed to.
Okay. And clearly the implementation, the work which is done by Mr Bailey and his colleagues, that is based in the Cabinet Office. Are there any challenges for you as Home Secretary in keeping track of what's going on essentially with officials in another government department?
There haven't been. I expect that his department to talk to me and raise any issues with me as they come up, and I have found that has worked perfectly well because I can have easy and swift access to the Foreign Secretary or the Defence Secretary if I need to challenge them.
So the situation is that you've got a team within the Cabinet Office who report to you unless there is something that emerges in between on a quarterly basis, and you then have a meeting twice a year, at which point you then report to the Prime Minister.
In addition to additional letters, correspondence, if it's needed, or to update me on things that are going better than we had thought before, areas where I might have asked for a deep dive into a particular area, I would not expect them to wait every 6 months to update me, but to give me the information as soon as they have it.
So, am I correct in assuming, therefore, that it's not just once every 3 months, but you're receiving material on the implementation on a weekly basis, or some aspects of it?
I haven't really received it on a weekly basis, but I mean every few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, I might receive a letter or a note regarding something that I've raised to do with previous correspondence or to do with a quarterly return, or I might ask to see Sir Mark before a national security meeting, because we meet every week, in order to check up on one particular element, just to catch him in conversation about it if I'm concerned. The fact that I have access to Sir Mark and the other relevant foreign and defence secretaries is very helpful for chivying along or catching up on what are concerns.
And how often do implementation matters come up at the weekly meeting? Or is that so agendaed that it never arises there?
They don't emerge as a result of my committee, but the NSC meeting weekly enables the Prime Minister to have a view of what is taking place in terms of the commitments that we've already entered into.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Morrison?
Of the 89 implementation points, your predecessor as chairman of your subcommittee identified 2, both of them broadly speaking, defence things. Do they remain your chief priorities, or have your priorities changed or shifted? And if so, what are they among the 89?
Do you want to tell me which the words
They are reserves and MOD apprentices.
Well, we know that the recruitment for reserves and for maintaining the Army at 82,000, so retention as well, and the 50,000 apprentices during this next 5-year period is a challenging and ambitious target. So yes, I would say that is one of my primary concerns. The Defence Secretary, of course, is completely aware of that, and we have plans which he has set out for me and for others on what to do about that, how to improve retention, how to improve recruitment in an economy which is doing well. It's not obvious necessarily that how to attract the best people. We've put in place various initiatives like Help to Buy for the armed forces so they can acquire property, more family-friendly regulations. Yes, that is one area where we do have concerns, but we are taking action.
Yes, I'd like to talk about the funds that are available to support this. There's the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund, which we discovered the other day we were responsible to Parliament for. But we have a slight problem because we'd be mildly interested to know what countries this a lot of this money is spent in, and we can't be told because it's secret. So we do feel slightly that we're groping around a bit in the dark, not knowing really what's going on. But do you have responsibility for the Prosperity Fund and the new Empowerment Fund, as well as the CSSF?
Well, these three funds are part of the SDSR delivery and our commitments. And as far as the CSSF is concerned, we have 97 programmes in 40 different countries. I think they do a great job in reaching out in terms of addressing UK interests in unstable areas, such as the White Helmets in Syria, where we do great work. I hope that there's enough information for the committee to have confidence in those funds. If the Chair would like me to arrange a closed briefing or any confidential information, I will, of course, forward it. In terms of the accountability for it, it's for the NSC, isn't it?
Yes. When I gave evidence to this committee before, Madam Chair, you'll recall that I know you would love to have more transparency about the individual programmes, but I did explain on that occasion that because we're working in some very difficult countries with some sensitive partners, it's not always possible to be completely open and transparent about each programme in all of the 40 countries. But I think we were able to give you on that occasion an indication of the amounts of money that we're spending in the main countries in conflict, and to give you some examples of the sort of programmes that we're supporting. In terms of the governance structure, it is the NSC that sets the allocations. That process happens on a yearly basis. They have recently signed off the allocations for the years 2017-18. So it is all the work that the CSSF does is in pursuit of NSC strategies. So it is the NSC that is the ultimate accountability mechanism, if you like, for the fund.
But perhaps, Home Secretary, I give you just a little bit more sort of yes, Minister detail on this. We were told that if we were told about the individual countries, this might create enormous embarrassment in the countries that were receiving the funds, and then it would also create envy among other countries that weren't receiving funds. The result was they couldn't really tell us about any countries at all. Well, one happens to know that we're helping the Lebanon, Jordan, Libya, Iraq, Syria. I mean, this is in the public domain. So it seems to be very odd that we can't be told more about what individual countries are benefiting from the funds that we're giving them.
Well, I think I have to be mindful of what the National Security Advisor here has said in terms of confidentiality. But please allow me to take that away as something to consider how I can improve any communication with the committee and consider whether there's any further information I can share so that there's not quite such a yes minister feeling about the situation.
Thank you very much.
Just one thing, Home Secretary, I'm grateful to you for the suggestion that you've made, and as you will have gathered, the committee is not yet content that we have the detail that we would like to see, although we completely understand. I think we are the last people on this committee not to understand the reservations expressed by the National Security Advisor. But it does strike me that we did express a lot of these reservations in our last report, which of course the government hasn't yet had the opportunity to reply to. And it may be that the occasion of that reply will give the opportunity for ministers and officials to consider what more might come forward, particularly in the context of some kind of annual report on the CSSF.
I will take that away to consider and discuss it with the National Security Advisor about how we can best accommodate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I also just pick up...
Perhaps I could just add, Home Secretary, though, that we have committed to doing an annual report
Indeed.
on the CSSF, and we are looking carefully at the proposal your committee made for having a single minister in charge, and that's one of the options that we're looking at. And I hope that we'll be able to give a response when we give our formal response to your report.
That's very helpful. Is there anything more that you can say about the other two funds that Lord Hamilton mentioned?
The Empowerment Fund and the Prosperity Fund.
Indeed.
The Prosperity Fund is 1.3 billion, and the fund particularly creates opportunities for business, including UK companies. So £55 million of funds were spent in the first year, but again, I'm not sure I can be hugely transparent about it because the National Security Council have authority over it, but it does have quite a good rating, has a very good rating from IKA about the progress it's made in the short time frame in the fund's systems and processes. So the spending target is already under active review. And why don't I include more information about it if I have it in the response that I give following this meeting?
Thank you very much. I've got Lord West, Mr. Blunt and Dr. Morrison.
As we found, much to our surprise, that we have this responsibility for all of this and keeping an eye on it. Which minister do you believe we should call as the key minister who has a response in front of us, as the minister who has the key responsibility for these funds? And is there one who has a responsibility for all three funds? And if there isn't, should there be a minister who has responsibility overall for all three funds, so that we could call that minister, so that we could carry out our duties to actually scrutinise these funds?
Yes, I think that Lord West has raised an interesting potential omission, shall we say. And as the National Security Advisor said, we are looking at that for the CSSF. There is the same issue for the Prosperity Fund, which is it is basically reports to the National Security Council. So we should consider as well potentially ministerial cover there.
The Foreign Affairs Committee reported last week on our relations with Russia and looked particularly at the use of the Empowerment Fund with reference to the Ukraine, where we identified the £20 million, I think it was, that's set aside for Ukraine-related programmes, and that as utterly inadequate to the task of securing Ukraine within the Euro-Atlantic area, where empowerment and good governance in Ukraine is a central strategic interest, you could argue, for the United Kingdom because of Ukraine's relationship with Russia. How are you going to oversee the proper allocation of resources within the fund, where that number appears to us to be wholly inadequate to the strategic interests of the UK?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Blunt, what I would say is that our commitment to Ukraine, which incidentally we're going to be discussing in the National Security Council tomorrow, isn't limited to the Empowerment Fund. That is just one very small part of the overall UK investment in support of Ukraine. So I wouldn't want you to think that was the totality of our effort in supporting Ukraine. The investment fund is really in its very initial stages. It's only just been set up. Money hasn't been allocated at all, really, for programmes starting next year. So that process is ongoing. So I don't think the figure you quote is necessarily the definitive figure anyway from that fund.
Can I congratulate you on the Empowerment Fund? We don't know a lot about it yet because it hasn't been formally established, but nevertheless its aims and ambitions appear to be wholly laudable. But they do seem to overlap quite a lot with the sorts of things that DIT is doing. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that is a reasonable observation, and whether DIT, which I accept is primarily not concerned with security, but nevertheless is a major government department, seems to me to have an interest in the sorts of things you intend this fund to do around governance, education, culture, in particular the extension, I imagine, of the English language.
Yes, I mean, I would expect the fund to work closely with DIT to make sure that the benefits of this fund are also felt by the initiatives in DIT. So we would work closely together to make sure that those initiatives and that benefit is shared across the departments.
Okay. Lord Ramsbottom.
Home Secretary, can I switch to cyber? Because that is the subject of our next inquiry. And you know that the cyber is one of the four main priorities that we're looking at in the national defence. And we're unclear as to who is actually responsible. I mean, this committee said in last year in its comments on the National Security Strategy and the SDSR that the lines of responsibility and accountability on cyber within Whitehall remained unclear. And there is, of course, an NSC committee which is chaired by the Chancellor. But the Minister for the Cabinet Office and the Minister of State for Digital and Cyber and Culture also have cyber security as listed under their responsibilities. But all ministries actually must be facing up to the threat from cyber, as we've seen in the examples in the Baltics, that the traffic lights went out first and so on. So everyone must be continued. But I wonder if you could advise us as to actually which minister we ought to call to give evidence to this committee on the whole question of cyber security.
Yes, well, at risk of volunteering myself from another session, I also have quite a strong interest in cyber from a sort of homeland security point of view, particularly through the National Crime Agency that does a lot of work on the dark web to track organised crime. The answer to your question is that it does have a lot of ministerial cover because it is an area that crosses over to so many different departments, as you rightly said, culture, media and sport through the digital agenda, the Chancellor through the prosperity agenda, and the Cabinet Office who are coordinating it. So the Chancellor does chair the subcommittee, but I think I would humbly suggest that depending on where your focus is going to be, because it covers so many different areas, defence, organised crime, sexual exploitation, digital element, that I would focus on the different ministers' responsibilities. Perhaps everybody could have the opportunity.
I have three colleagues at the moment who want to come in. Lord West, Lord Hamilton and Lady Faulkner. Lord West?
When I produced the first ever cybersecurity strategy in 2008, most people couldn't spell cyber actually in government. And I had huge difficulty in getting some departments to accept there would even be a cyber strategy. When the cyber strategy came out, I was made the cybersecurity minister. And Home Secretary, I hear what you say about talking to, work out which thing we're interested in, but it does seem, bearing in mind the all-embracing nature of cyber now, that there should be a minister who sees as their role as absolutely making sure this is coordinated across departments, that we're really focused on it. I mean, I know a lot of work's gone on with the NCSC. I know the SDSR has changed its name to whatever it bloody well is now and is monitored within the Cabinet Office. But it does seem it seems extraordinary to me that we haven't got one minister who actually sees it as his or her responsibility in whichever department this is, that coordination is going correctly. I mean, and I just find it extraordinary that we would have to identify, well, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I mean, do you really think that's satisfactory, or is it something that has just happened within Whitehall and that's the way it is? And is it something, that maybe we should think about saying, we ought to think this ought to change?
I think it is a crowded place in terms of different ministerial responsibilities. And I think it is a reasonable suggestion you are making, Lord West. I mean, it's something that perhaps a number of us can reflect on.
Yes, I think we do have that discussion about whether it's better to bring it all together within one minister or to have a range of ministers involved. I mean, one of the counter-arguments to your point is that it's really important that all cabinet ministers recognise the importance of cyber to their individual businesses.
Yes, but you can be a power that makes that happen, can't you, Sir Mark?
You need to bring it together on occasions. We accept that, and the Chancellor is, as the Home Secretary said, chairs the subcommittee that brings that together. The Minister of the Cabinet Office has a role also in coordination. But if you're looking at digital skills and building up the cyber skills within the education system, I mean, it is more DCMS and DFE that need to be involved in that. And so one doesn't want to take away the responsibility of the line Secretaries of State to focus on cyber as well.
But I don't think that does that, if I may. Anyway, okay.
Can I mention that there's also this question of awareness. And I mean, it's very important that all staff in every ministry should be aware of the threat and looking out for it. And that needs to be coordinated. I would have thought that the ministries are all aware.
And any big, huge, complex thing obviously has lots of people working in detail in those areas. But, in my experience, it's very good to have one person. If you're going to chop someone's legs off, you want one person to legs chop off if they get it wrong. And it's quite a good way of doing things very often.
I would suggest that person the Chancellor has at the moment.
Can we put that in as a recommendation?
Yes,
Cybercrime has created a serious industry of people involved in cyber security. And it strikes me that a lot of the commercial sector is basically left responsible for its own cyber security and has to pay for it. Have you got a clear idea, Home Secretary, in your own mind as to where government responsibility for cyber and cybercrime begins and ends, and where the private sector? I mean, there must be a dividing line, isn't there? Have you got a view on where that lies?
You're absolutely right that although the government has a cyber strategy and now, of course, a new cyber centre, which opened 4 months ago, it is part of our mission to make sure that other people take responsibility as well. And so we have a cyber aware campaign to try to engage organisations, businesses, and make sure that they take action to protect themselves. As people in the industry often say, you wouldn't leave your front door open. Why would you leave your password for everyone to see, or not to take action to protect yourself? Since the Cyber Centre opened, they now have an agreement with 3,000 organisations and private sector businesses, which they update all the time on cyber threats and action that they can take. I think that we are picking up some good momentum on working with other organisations to try and help them take the steps they need to take, but also for them to have the confidence in us so that when something takes place, like if there is an incident with a telecoms company or a bank, they do come to the cyber centre so that they can report it rather than potentially want to keep it confidential, which occasionally they have been known to do, and that we can help them take action and stop it happening again. I think we're making good progress there.
Lady Faulkner?
Yes, I think this discussion, to me, illustrates the domestication of this whole area of oversight and goes into what we was our discussion earlier on Sir Mark Sedwell replacing Sir Mark Lyall Grant. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that the last NATO ministerial decided to include cyber as one of the threats to which there would be an Article 5 response. In light of that, it seems to be the fact that we have no minister that we can call on to, and particularly my concern is whether and to what extent that minister, a named person, should there be a named person, would have the foreign FCO and defence angle in his armoury. I can't see it, frankly, having listened to that discussion. But my broader point is perhaps would we, if there was a similar style attack on Estonia, would that be considered as part of the Article 5 response, perhaps, in terms of NATO?
I wouldn't want
the banking system in Estonia?
Yeah. I wouldn't want you to think that it's about only the UK. Our cyber strategy recognises that there are state-sponsored cyber attacks as well, and the Defence Secretariat is very alert to that and the need for offensive cyber as well as defensive cyber. So he will, where necessary, and we have discussed this at the NSC, make sure that our cyber strategy is part of our armoury to make sure that we have the right tools and the right covering within international law to respond where we need to.
I now also have Lord Mitchell and Dr. Morrison. Lord Mitchell.
Yes, Home Secretary. I have a real sense of foreboding about all of this, to be honest. The speed of development in the whole digital IT area is increasing exponentially. It's getting faster and faster and faster. We had a very interesting session that this committee did where we had Melissa Hathaway, who was the cyber advisor to President Obama. And she said a number of things, one of which was fascinating to me, is that by 2020 there will be 50 billion devices, 50 billion in the world connected to the internet. And the possibilities of all sorts of effects is really quite dramatic. And why I say foreboding, because I just sort of feel that the epicenter of this whole debate is getting further and further away from where we are and where we need to be. And I just need to be reassured of some of this.
I would say that the National Security Council and ministers involved in this area are very much alert to the growth of cyber, the growth of the devices, have you said, and the real danger of not staying ahead of this. The transfer and movement of data is central to so much that we do in terms of keeping the UK and its citizens safe, which is why that the Cyber Centre is, of course, under the oversight of GCHQ, which most people recognise as one of the international leaders in this area. I think one of the essential things that we have to do to stay ahead is to make sure that we train people, that we get the best people so that they're always going to be able to keep up. GCHQ has its training programme in Cheltenham. The new Cyber Centre has training programmes here in London, Cyber First, Cyber Girls, to make sure that we recruit the best people. And we're already working with experts in the private sector. So someone like the NCA has cyber specials who work primarily for the private sector, but who also work under contract with the NCA for part of the year in order to give their extraordinary skills to make sure that we stay ahead. So I share your sense of concern, but I'm more optimistic about us staying ahead.
Is it not the case that some reassurance can be gleaned from the fact that we appear to have more than doubled our spend on cyber security? Would you agree, Home Secretary, that particularly as we approach Brexit, it's very important that the UK remains the go-to nation for cyber security, which we appear to be, and that's our offer to partners at a difficult time, and also that we need to ensure that financial services in this country are particularly robust when it comes to this threat, to encourage them to remain within the UK. And finally, do you have any concerns at all that our much publicised cyber apprentices may constitute a college of crime, and that they may cause us more problems than they solve?
A very worrying final question. I hope not. I hope that our good values that they will get from being part of our cyber centre will impart to them will make sure that they don't turn to crime, if I may say so. In terms of our other points, of course, increasing spending has been critical and is going to enable us to keep our lead. In terms of the EU offer, yes, we are regarded with European partners as one of the leaders in this area, and it is particularly about the strength of GCHQ, which has been helpful to other countries in some of their incidents. And in terms of financial services, we are going to have to make sure that we have a system whereby the financial services can stay central to our UK economy as we leave the EU, and have some sort of arrangement with data which supports them, which we can get agreement with on the EU.
Lord Pole.
Sorry, just one more question on cyber, Home Secretary. In other areas of our defence, we have the concept of arms control. Do you think it's feasible to think in terms of codes of conduct in the cyber area applying to state cyber activities?
Well, there is already an agreement that cyber activity falls within the same restrictions as within international law of other activities. So there is the architecture is already in place up to a point, but I expect it is something we will have to revisit.
I mean, the architecture may be there, but it isn't actually being used to any great effect. And I just wonder whether you can think of, within the National Security Council, of something more specific being developed.
Conrad, perhaps you could answer that. Mr. Bailey, can I ask Mr. Bailey?
So, I mean, I think I'm not a deep expert in this area, but we are working both multilaterally, but also with our close allies, and particularly our partners in US, Australia, Canada, within NATO, to try and make sure we can operate effectively. But it's an area where there's a lot more work to be done. I think that's clearly the case.
But a code of conduct would apply to our enemies as well as to our allies. That's my point.
So I mean, that's certainly not an area that I've worked on. So I'm not an expert on it, I'm afraid. I don't know whether Bart.
I would just add two things, Lord Powell. I mean, one is on the bilateral side, we have reached an agreement with China, for instance, that against bilateral industrial espionage, if you like. Obviously, implementing that agreement is ongoing. Separately, there is the multilateral sphere, and in that there has been quite a lot of discussion actually at the United Nations about whether to develop guidelines and norms for international practice. And here one has to get the balance right between not balkanising the internet, because there are many countries that would actually like to control cyberspace for their own reasons that we don't share, but at the same time having norms and rules which would prevent the use of the internet for child sexual exploitation and other things. So we are looking both multilaterally and in specific cases bilaterally at developing that sort of norm environment.
But we're the ones preventing progress here on an international basis, aren't we? Because of our anxiety that if we have rules here, we'll obey them and other nations won't. Isn't that rather like saying there shouldn't be laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, because there'll be because we'll obey them and the other side wouldn't? And actually, we need to get into a space where there is at least a set of standards against which everyone can be held in this area.
I wouldn't say that we're preventing it, but you're right to say that we are cautious because we would not want to establish guidelines or rules that we follow but that we know that others may not. So we want to get the wording of that right, and that is an ongoing discussion. With the new US administration coming in, that's one of the discussions we're having with them.
Doesn't this leave us in a somewhat legally and morally exposed position where we're the ones opposing suggestions that there should be regulation in this area and some degree of codification of what is and is not acceptable by states?
No, I don't think so. We're not by any means alone in our caution in this area. It is a multilateral discussion that is ongoing at the UN, and there are different groups coming at this issue from different angles because it is extremely complicated.
I think Lord West wanted to come in on the apprenticeships.
To the Chinese issue, and I'm very interested in how much discussion there's been on this. And I mean, we know the problems with Huawei, switchgear, lack of visibility, updated remotely. We know the issues of the biggest data centre in the UK having been purchased by a Chinese company, which ostensibly is not government-owned, but anyway, it's a Chinese company, and now a government-owned Chinese company buying the biggest CCTV structure within Europe, with all of the implications for the Internet of Things. We know that CESG has discovered dormant malware in quite a lot of systems relating to our critical national infrastructure. Is there any subcommittee or subgroup looking at what the totality of all of this means? Because it seems to have significant implications when you add all of these things together. And I know that, for example, within the United States, they have set up a whole group that are looking at these aspects, and of course they've excluded things like Huawei, but they're looking at this in great detail.
Yes, Lord West. I mean, there is a group. It's called the Infrastructure Security Group, and it's chaired by my deputy, one of my two deputies, and that looks on a regular basis at the whole question of foreign investment into critical national infrastructure, and that collates the foreign investment bids and alerts ministers accordingly if there is the issues of concern. And as you know, the Business Secretary is developing some ideas precisely on this for the government as a whole at the moment. So there's a lot of work going on in this area.
Moving on to a slightly different topic, but it is with Lord West.
Second, I think. Yes, this is the issue of the Joint Force 2025. And having looked at the funding and having looked at where we stand and having looked at what the equipment lists are for Force 2025, they don't seem to stack up. And I'm asking the Home Secretary, are you concerned in the context of you looking at SDSR and implementation of it, that there are going to be some problems and shortfalls in this area? Because certainly with this facts and statistics available to people like me, and that's not as obviously as thorough as yours, it does not look as though that Force 2025 is going to be met by 2025. For example, the number of ships is going to be less than the figure that was there. And I wondered, is this an issue that has concerned you?
Well, I think it's attached, isn't it, to the issue of army recruitment and retention, Joint Force 2025. I mean, it's a 10-year plan. We think that it is ambitious, but we still can deliver on it. It is one of the most important commitments, but it is one, of course, that goes through 2020. So it is something that I will continue to challenge the Defence Secretary on at our regular meetings. And I am aware that because of the challenges of recruitment in the armed forces, we need to make sure that we keep these numbers up to enable the full delivery to be available by 2025.
I agree that's one area that's very worrying, and manpower is worrying in the Navy. But I was thinking just in terms of equipment. As I say, there will be less ships than those were predicted for 2025. At the moment, I cannot see how one can get round that, just purely by looking at how long it takes to build a ship. Similarly, there are issues in terms of aircraft as well. And I wondered whether you're concerned, and have you, for example, have you personally had a chance to speak with the Chief of Defence Staff on and I don't expect you necessarily to say what you said with him here, but to be able to talk to him about his concerns or otherwise, because you're able to get that truth. Clearly he can't speak that truth when he's talking in public.
I can get that truth, and I will speak to him about it if I need to. But can I first of all ask Mr. Bailey just to address your point about ship numbers?
So, I mean, I think the commitment as set out in the SDSR remains very much as it is. Obviously, Sir John Parker provided his independent report on the National Shipbuilding Strategy back in November. Work's now going on. It was obviously quite a full and complex report that needed proper attention. That work's being led out of the Ministry of Defence, but being done across government to look at how we can implement that report, to look at the recommendations within it, and we're due to publish a national shipbuilding strategy, which I think goes to the core of your question of how will you ensure you have.
But Conrad, I'm on side with all of what you're saying. I understand that, but the bottom line is that the number will be less than was said there would be for 2025, and I cannot see any way that can be achieved. It's just impractical to actually do it. I'm just interested. I mean, I'm not having a go at you for it, because you're looking at all the various things. But I think we mustn't ever delude ourselves in thinking we are getting to something. We're not going to get there.
So I mean, I think the report by Sir John does set out some suggestions on how those numbers can.
It does, but he won't meet those timescales. I won't go there. But I must say, I think we must not delude ourselves about reality. That's all I'm saying.
No, it's
one understands difficulties, but we mustn't delude ourselves.
Yeah, okay. Well, I will make sure that I take the opportunity to pursue extra challenges following that point.
In the delivery of the Vanguard programme in the 1990s, the programme was rescued in terms of assessment by the National Audit Office, in terms of financing, because of the movement of currency that helped, meant it was only one out of the 25 major programmes they looked at from memory that actually came in under budget. The currency is going in the other direction now, and it would certainly seem from the data provided to this committee and others that that currency fluctuation is blowing your assumptions about what you can actually have to pay for actual kit out of the water.
This is an important issue, and it is one I have raised. The Defence Secretary will reassure us that they have hedged for a period, and you would expect them to. So it won't impact immediately, and of course we don't know where the currency will be in 2 years' time. But it is something that we are very aware of and could impact after 2 years if it's in the same place, if we have a situation where our purchasing power is down by 15%. It will have an impact. You are right, Mr. Blunt. But at the moment, the situation is that it is hedged for a period.
For 2 years?
For 2 years.
Well, this is Joint Force 2025, and then we're talking about a successor which comes into service in the mid-2030s.
But I don't know, none of us know what the currency will be like after 2 years. But I accept your point, which is that it could impact on our ability to purchase, given the certain amount of money that has been committed to this, and there might have to be conversations with the Chancellor at that stage.
Lord Mitchell.
Yes, we'll do well to get this question answered before we have a division coming up, but let me try. I want to talk about geopolitical issues, if I could, and I suppose our two key relationship countries are France and the United States. In France, of course, Brexit is happening, and also there are elections there, and we certainly don't know the result of how that's all going to go. And in the United States, it seems to be a totally different environment, although there seems to be some pulling back on some of the excessive positions that the President has come out with. But I just really would like to know, Home Secretary, your view of how our relationships with France will be, how you expect them to be. And secondly, as far as the United States is concerned, how difficult do you anticipate this to be in the future as well?
Thank you. I mean, on France, I find that our relationship remains strong and enduring. They are like us. They spend a large amount on their defence. After us, they are the largest in Europe. We have the expeditionary force planned with them. Everything we do is underpinned by the Lancaster House Treaty of 2010. It is close from my point of view in terms of counter-terrorism. It is close from the Defence Secretary's point of view. I believe he has meetings or conversations almost every month, sometimes every other month, with his opposite number. So on nuclear defence security on France, it is close, and I believe it will continue to be so. They share the same interests as we do in terms of security. And on America, they remain our strongest and closest ally, and there is no indication that that has changed in any way. Indeed, one might go further to say it's the opposite, given that the Prime Minister early on got their commitment with President Trump to give his commitment to NATO, which of course underpins all our security here.
Mr. Neil.
Home Secretary, can I just move on to another Brexit-related topic, which is the broad issue of security and justice cooperation. Now, due on time? Do you want to suspend it for a bit? Or should we carry on? Carry on. I'll carry on. If you can hear me, anyway. Yeah. The Prime Minister made it clear in the Lancaster House speech that that's one of the 12 top priorities. You've referred to the importance of the European arrest warrant in that context, even earlier today. But the reality is, isn't it, that the arrest warrant, membership of Europol, Eurojust, and then also the information systems like ECRIS and Schengen Information System 2, they're all actually mutually reinforcing and linked together, aren't they? You can't disaggregate them. Do you accept that?
Well, I accept that they are.
Home Secretary, I'm sorry. I think at this point I do need to suspend the committee in case colleagues wish to go and vote. If there were to happen to be 3 members of the Lords who did not need to go or wish to go and vote, we could continue because we would then be quorate. But, yeah, I think the indication is you're going. We're still quorate. Yes, but there's Charles and David and Harry. Okay, we can continue. Sorry, Home Secretary, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to wait till that noise is stopped.
Mr. Neil, you're absolutely right. These elements of our security that we have access to through the European Union do keep us much safer. ECRIS, SIS2, the Schengen Information System, Europol. And we hope to negotiate with the European Union a new agreement whereby we have access to those and they benefit from our ongoing participation as well as us having access to them.
The head of Lynn Owens, the director of the National Crime Agency, described the importance of sustaining our current access. So no diminution. Is that the view that you share?
That would be a desirable outcome. We do benefit from having access to these different initiatives. In fact, the UK has led on setting them up and on persuading other European Union members to participate in them. We know that they do help to keep people safe. My interaction with other interior ministers from the EU is that they would like us to participate. We have to find a way of making sure that we can deliver that, and I certainly hope without any diminution.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think the has also said that loss of access to SIS2, for example, would seriously inhibit our ability to, in effect, catch, to paraphrase her words, those who are a threat to security.
I mean, the transfer of information across Europe about those sort of people who are a threat to security is absolutely key to making sure that we keep people safe. where I reassure colleagues and myself and generally people who have shown interest in this area is that the UK is a leading participant in these initiatives. So I feel that it is reciprocal in terms of our desired ongoing participation in some form.
And a final question from me, Madam Chairman. The Justice Committee had some evidence that suggests this. In practical terms, to continue with access to the information that's in the data systems, it's going to be necessary post-Brexit that our data information regulation and legal framework is equivalent to that which still will continue to pertain in the EU. Otherwise, they can't lawfully share the information on their systems with us. Is that recognised as being a key priority to be achieved?
It is recognised as a key priority, making sure that we have a system whereby we can all transfer data under a regulation which is satisfactory to different countries is going to be critical to any final agreement.
Thank you. Mrs. Villiers.
Thank you. The SDSR committed the government to updating its counter-terrorism strategy in 2016, but according to the briefings we've had for the committee today, the revised strategy hasn't yet been published. And I wondered if you could share with us what stage it's got to, what are the reasons behind the delay?
It is at its final stage. I expect it to publish it very soon. It is one of the areas I'm acutely conscious we are behind on already, but I will be putting that right very soon. I'm looking forward to doing a refresh of the contest strategy, and as I say, that will be very soon.
And we've obviously had a chance to discuss in some detail the efforts you make in your capacity to hold other departments and ministers to account in terms of their performance on aspects of the overall strategy. In relation to this matter, specifically the delay, but just in general, who is performing that function in relation to you as Home Secretary, who is challenging you to ensure that these kind of deadlines are met?
Well, other members of the National Security Council are aware that the contest relaunch, the new contest, is coming out soon and are expecting it to do so. So I would say it's a big initiative, the counter-terrorism relaunch, and there's an awareness around the whole National Security Council that we need to deliver it very soon. In terms of the actual challenge at the 6 monthly meetings, of course, as I said before, I have the Minister of State there who would respond on that specifically.
And it was, I think in the SDSR states that contest is going to be updated through a new NSC committee on counter-terrorism. But my understanding is that subcommittee isn't any longer in existence. So it would be useful if you could set out the process by which the strategy is updated.
Well, we've had substantial discussions about it at NSC. So it's been discussed at the NSC itself at some length in order to make sure that all parties support the new direction and funding that is going forward on it. Is there anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's entirely fair. But I would hope that the strategy would be published in the course of this month. And
I appreciate that you won't be able to share with us, what's in the strategy before publication. But are there any sort of particular aspects which you can outline to us, which will look very different from the current strategy? What innovations do you expect to be included in the new strategy, which you might be able to explain to us?
Well, we have said that the counter-terrorism threat is increasingly from Daesh, and we need to take additional initiatives in order to make sure that less people are radicalised in the UK. So we will be putting extra effort, funding and ideas into how to do that, particularly nationally.
And is there an angle to contest work which looks specifically at women and efforts to prevent their being radicalised? Is there a distinctive approach related, for example, to young women, given the examples we've had of women travelling abroad?
Well, I can tell you that within the Prevent strategy, which is part of the initiatives within counter-terrorism, is we do put extra emphasis on making sure that we focus on community leaders, and those community leaders need to also be women, because sometimes you can find there's a list of community leaders and there aren't a sufficient number of women on them. I was in Leicester just about a week ago and met with some fantastic women who were leading Prevent initiatives through their community leadership, particularly to other young women. I do think it's important, because culturally they're not always in the same space, to make sure that we have enough women leaders in that initiative.
Thanks. Lord Trimble.
Thank you. Could we turn to the newly created Joint International Counterterrorism Unit?
Yeah.
I noticed that in March 2016, the Financial Times, referring to this, noted how it has effectively shifted from the Foreign Commonwealth Office, that the FCO's counterterrorism unit has been disbanded, and the new unit, International Counterterrorism Unit, is going to be headed by an FCO official who will then report to the Home Office's director of their existing Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism. So you've had quite a successful raid on the Foreign Office, but seriously, could you say what was the thinking behind it? And as this is an international unit, but located within the Foreign Office, is the Foreign Office going to in any way affect, or at least that seems to be to have the possibility of the perspective being altered? And are you sure that this isn't going to end up with too much focus on the home side of things and not enough on the international side of things? And perhaps you could throw in also whether there be any improvements flowing from this change, and anything else you think is relevant.
Well, my experience, if I may, of working with JIC2 is that it brings together two different areas of expertise very successfully. So we have the input from the Foreign Office about the international side, and we have the input from the Home Office about the impact of internationally inspired terrorists back in the UK. So I don't find there's the sort of friction that is perhaps suggested in your question. I think it's a way of harnessing the information and the expertise from the Foreign Office to make sure that both the Foreign Office and the Home Office have access to both sides. But in terms, you'd also asked about...
Does the Foreign Office have any unit left?
I'm afraid I'm not aware what the Foreign Office has in terms of its...
Because it looks as though this function has moved from the Foreign Office to the Home Office.
No, it is Lord Trimble, a genuinely joint unit.
Yeah.
The SDSR established about 7 new joint units to try and foster cooperative working across Whitehall, and this was one of them. As the Home Secretary said, the head of the JIC2 is a Foreign Office official, and JIC2 itself is made up of a mixture of officials from different government departments. It's hosted in the Home Office. It does report to a DG in the Home Office, but it reports equally to the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary for the work it does.
But the Foreign Office's counter-terrorism unit has been disbanded, so the Foreign Office no longer has that capability.
The Foreign Office has people who are overseas in overseas posts where a lot of the frontline counter-terrorism work happens overseas, but they report through to JIC2.
Yes, please.
Sorry. The 2016 annual report talked about a cross-government review into the funding of extremism in the UK, so I'd be interested on your comment about that, whether it's been successful or not, and you might like to take in Tom Keating of RUSI comment in the papers in August 2016, where he says that funding flows, as terrorist funding flows into the UK, our knowledge of these funding flows into the UK is limited to border cash declarations, providing little insight into the metrics that the Prime Minister said. Is that an accurate comment?
I'm sorry, I was just trying to find my notes on this particular element. We haven't published that review. Lord Trimble, you are right. Mm-hmm. We are still looking at what needs to be done. There has been some good work with the Charity Commission done in order to find out where there has been some misleading charities, organisations that have terrorist links trying to raise money as charities, and that we've worked closely with them to try and address that. In terms of looking at a proper review, that hasn't been taken forward at the moment, but it's something that we will look at again.
Lady Ford.
Madam Chairman, can I thank you for holding back that question while we went and voted? I want to take us back to the government's decision, given the significant changes that have happened in the international environment, not to reassess whether we needed a tweak to the national security strategy. Sir Mark, you're nodding. I refer, of course, to the fact that Brexit had happened and the government decided not to do that. Of course, the election of President Trump has, in my view, a serious impact on the relationship in terms of the strategy. And I heard the Home Secretary say that the relationship is stronger than ever, which makes me quite concerned on 2 or 3 points. One is that we have the strategy itself puts out you can see how dated it is. It talks about a conclusion of a successful TTIP. Well, that's gone. It talks about enhancing our cooperation on DFID USAID programs. That makes me rather alarmed because we think of the current US government's approach on contraception, for example. So are we going to be influenced by that? Are we going to be following the line of where Planned Parenthood and other people will be denied development aid for programs to do abroad? There are others. There's immigration. The 6 countries have been, the profiling list has come up again today. But more important than all of that is Mr. Trump's stated aim now to increase the arms race, particularly nuclear arms race. And one can't tell from tweets at 5 a.m, but it appears to me that there is a determination in terms of what he said to disregard arms control treaties of the past and to move in a direction of another arms race. If you really, Home Secretary, do you really believe that this is a great framework for an enhanced relationship with the US? The relationship being stronger than ever? Does that indicate that we're likely to go down the same route? And at what point will the government, what circumstances are there under which the government might produce a new strategy before 2020?
Can I just jump in? Because I did some research on this. Basically, Trump did say initially that he wanted to increase numbers, but since then he said no, he doesn't. But he wants to go ahead with Obama's plan to replace various systems. So it's not quite.
It's actually thank you for that intervention, because it supports my point that we have no idea. There is more confusion. We talk about certainty. In fact, the United States at the moment is a forum for uncertainty. One thing at 2 a.m, something else by 5 p.m. Are we absolutely clear in terms of our risk assessment of the future that we don't need to do anything till 2020?
I believe we should engage constructively and patiently with America as a friend and as an ally. Lady Faulkner, you've raised some interesting challenges that may be part of that relationship with President Trump, but I think it would be a mistake to redo our strategy based on that. I think that it is our responsibility to engage with our opposite numbers, just as the Prime Minister has engaged with President Trump, perhaps to influence as well as to continue the good work that we have done with them. I don't believe there is a need to redo the SDR. I think that it sets out the important principles of where we see the threats coming from in terms of international law, in terms of state activity, in terms of cyber, in terms of counterterrorism. Those 4 elements remain the dominant threats to the UK. I think it's absolutely right that we continue to use those as our guiding principle.
I wonder if I could come back, since you've mentioned cyber. Is the US one of the countries that has reservations about signing up to new legal norms in cyber? Mr. Blunt mentioned our role in that.
I'm afraid I don't know.
The new US administration has launched a review of cyber security strategy, and that hasn't come out yet. So we don't know exactly what the new administration's view will be on this.
Right. Home Secretary, I wonder whether you'd be able to therefore reassure us that our national security priorities, as defined in the paper and defined in ongoing discussions that we have, will continue to remain those priorities, and some of the things, the disruptions that I've mentioned, such as profiling countries that are Muslim and so on, and changing our rules in that regard. We will not be following the US. We will act on our own evidence and carry out our own foreign policy as we see fit.
I can reassure the Honourable Lady that is exactly what we will be doing.
Thank you. Lord West?
Yes, having just said that, though, can I be right in assessing that we have absolute clarity about the fact that our link with the United States is the most important link there is for the security of this country, and I have to say probably for the security of the globe, and that nothing at the moment has changed to make us change that perception, and that we are joined at the hip in so many ways in intelligence and in defence and other areas. That is still the position?
That is still the case, yes.
We seem to have come to the end of our questions. You'll be pleased to hear how it's happened. Oh, I do beg your pardon. Hadn't seen Lord Harris.
Dealt with while the Lords was voting. I had thought that the procedure was that the committee had to adjourn, but there we are. Could you tell us what's happened, Home Secretary, to the counter-extremism bill, which was included in the last Queen's speech? Are we still going to have one?
We are considering that at the moment. I can't be absolutely give the Honourable Lord complete confirmation on that, but we are continuing to consider it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. Mr. Bailey, Sir Mark, we wish you well in your retirement. Thank you very much for your attendance today and for your answers. Order, order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently in private. 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 The proceeding is currently in private.